You got more money coming to your bank account, and one man's insurrection is another man's tourist visit. I guess we'll accept that man who calls it a tourist visit was asking for preemptive presidential pardons, it appears. A lot to talk about this week on the Insiders with Brian Gaddie, our Democratic insider, Abdul-Hakim Shabazz, conservative commentator, also from IndyPolitics.org. Let's start in Indiana first, and the money that apparently is coming to us. We talked a little bit about this last week, the inflation relief plan from the governor. Abdul, $225 per taxpayer, $1 billion total from the state's reserves. Is that about what you expected?
It doesn't surprise me that, first of all, the governor, they waited until they had the revenue forecasts in so they could see how much money they actually had. Because I know my Democratic friends have been saying, cut the gas tax, cut this tax, but there have been no revenue projections to see how this would impact the state's budget. Now that we have those numbers, we can provide Hoosiers with some relief in a sustainable and thoughtful kind of way that Indiana still meets all its other commitments. So once again, with the economy doing relatively well as far as tax collections go, who's going to see that possibly that $1 billion in tax relief? The minus side to that, though, is that the governor's plan is to deal with inflation, but I'm not really quite sure putting more money in the system where we're not increasing the supply of goods is going to resolve our inflationary issues. But that's the question we'll have for the governor a little bit later when he has a news conference this weekend.
And I'll get to that in a second. But Brian, let me touch on what Democrats think, because Democrats have said for months now, among other arguments, why don't we use the surplus? Why don't we use the surplus for this and that? Well, the governor is using the surplus now. What do you think?
Well, it's a great move by Governor Holcomb, and I'm glad he's doing it. I mean, when the governor does something right, I'll applaud him. When he doesn't, I will point it out to Hoosier voters. He's doing the right thing here. I mean, there's sometimes where if you can have bipartisan agreement on something, then you try to have that possibility. And Hoosiers need relief. I mean, you just look at gas. We talked about it last week. Gas prices were under $5. I think it was $4.89. Now they're past $5. Now they're $5.25. So Hoosiers are hurting, not just gas prices, inflation prices. We need to provide economic relief for Hoosiers to get us through these tough times. So I applaud Governor Holcomb's efforts.
Before we get to the inflation side of this, Brian, the executive director of the Indiana Democratic Party, Laura Ganappini, stated that this was good, but she also characterized it as too little too late. And again, made the Democrats call what they've been calling for weeks for a suspension of the gas tax. Do you think that's something that still needs to happen?
Yes, absolutely, it should happen. And even though Governor Holcomb has taken the right step in doing this, I wish he would have done it a lot sooner. So I definitely agree with Lauren. We Democrats are for economic relief for Hoosiers, to try to get Hoosiers through these tough times, especially with these high gas prices. And yes, Governor Holcomb has done the right thing. I wish he would have done it sooner. So yes, I agree with Lauren.
Yeah, but here's the problem, though, once again, with cutting the gas tax. Number one, it's bad public policy because you still have roads going to be fixed. And the inflationary pressures on roads and road construction is actually higher than is in the regular consumer markets. That's kind of point number one. Point number two, by providing Hoosier taxpayers with an income tax rebate, what the governor and the legislature is doing is basically targeting those tax cuts to Hoosiers who actually pay the taxes. Now, we're not talking about the trucks and all that go through back and forth Indiana, because we've cut the gas tax. It's cut on them too. This is specific targeted relief, toward Hoosiers. Now, what's the effect going to be on inflation? That remains to be seen. But at least in this perspective, it's a targeted tax cut toward Hoosiers who actually pay the taxes, not to the general population that drives back and forth across Indiana.
Well, we know the cut in the gas tax almost assuredly isn't going to happen because the governor's not for it. Republicans in the legislature are not for it. But let's talk about inflation. Two economists that I respect immensely, Mike Hicks from Ball State, Micah Pollock from IU Northwest, certainly on different sides of what you would call supply and demand to economic policy. But they both agree, Abdul, that simply giving more money to Hoosiers like this, even though it's not really that much, it's a couple tanks of gas for some people, it's going to cause more inflation. There's no way around that.
And that I tend to agree with our economic friends, which is why when the governor has his news conference this weekend, I plan to ask him, Governor, how will these $250, $225 tax cuts provide Hoosiers with relief from inflation? Because all we're doing is basically pouring more money into the system, but we're not increasing the supply. Inflation, for the most part, is good old supply and demand. We've got a lot of money running around, and there's a lot of demand for goods and services, but those goods and services aren't there. So unless we increase the goods and services, That's how we are going to bring down inflation. I don't necessarily think throwing more money into the system is going to necessarily do it. But once again, that'll be a question for the governor to ask.
Still, it seems politically a pretty smart move in an election year. I mean, yes, Republicans are going to be on the ballot in Indiana. They can now go and they can say, hey, we provided inflation relief. And up until now, as Abdul has pointed out a number of times, Brian, inflation would seem like, again, conventional wisdom, still a long way from November, that inflation could be a political liability for Democrats since they're in charge in Washington. And regardless of the cause, and we know it's supply and demand, but regardless of the cause, this happened on Democrats' watch.
Well, President Biden is taking steps to try to deal with the deleterious effects of inflation and gas prices. So voters have to know, and I do think voters will in the end see that we Democrats are making efforts to try to deal with the impact of inflation. And we just have to hope voters see that and reward us with allowing us to retain the House of Representatives and the Senate. So am I going to say this is not a challenging economic environment? Of course not. That would just be naive to say otherwise. It's going to be a very challenging political environment for us Democrats. But in the end, I think voters will see, hey, we're making the efforts to try to deal with inflation and high gas prices, and hopefully they'll reward us with allowing us to retain control of Congress.
Something else that I guess we'll just have to see how big of an effect it has on November is happening this week, or it started this past week. The public hearings of the January 6th committee, the committee investigating the January 6th insurrection at the U.S. Capitol, January 6, 2021, of course, when Donald Trump was still the president. For those of us who've been paying attention, and that would include our insiders, Abdul and Brian, really, I don't think we're going to be surprised by much that's revealed in the public hearings. Yes, we're going to hear technically new evidence, but as far as surprise, well, we've seen this coming. We've known what was coming. I guess the question, Abdul, is what does this mean? And is it too early to tell what this means for Republicans? Because they've been trying to characterize this election year about the economy, as we've said, about inflation. And yet here is all of this evidence being thrown back into the public's face and the voters' faces saying, hey, a lot of these people either actively or somewhat tried to overthrow the government in 2021.
Yeah. Now, first of all, I heard Kevin McCarthy and some other Republicans say, well, what about hearings on Afghanistan? What about hearings on the riots in the streets and all that other stuff? And what about inflation, blah, blah, blah. And that's a fine political argument to make. But I do believe lawmakers can walk and chew gum at the same time. I actually do believe that. They may not do it very well, but I think they can do it. What I found most interesting about the first night of hearings was the fact that we finally got people on the record saying that there was no systemic election fraud. I mean, you got them on the record, got Bill Barr saying it, you got Ivanka Trump agreeing with it, got a good chunk of the Trump administration folks agreeing with it. And yeah, Donald Trump, who was basically wanting to fire most of the Justice Department to get people in place so he could stop the election. That, to me, my friends, is treason and insurrection. It's not with torches and pitchforks, but it's pretty much the exact same thing. So what I'm hoping to get out of these hearings is some sort of accountability, because you cannot, just like I said, the Black Lives Matter people could not tear up downtown Indianapolis, and the Trump protesters cannot try to overthrow the government. It is that simple.
Well, and again, we're painting a broad brush here. Sometimes when we talk about protesters, we're talking about 2,000 people in the Capitol, and but at the same time, we're talking about, as we know from public polling, a large chunk of the Republican Party still believes that the election was "quote unquote" stolen. We've known the whole time that wasn't the case, and now we have more people on the record. Brian, I think the question is, yes, Democrats want to be able to use this politically, but in the end, the way the media ecosystem is, you have the major network that caters to more conservative-minded people, not even covering the hearings, and they're probably not going to pay any attention to them anyway. What does this mean in the end for Democrats and their electoral prospects in November?
Well, for those Republicans that are not watching the hearings because Fox is not covering them, not just Fox News, but Newsmax, OAN. It's just Republican. We all are in our news silos these days. As a Democrat, I watch MSNBC and CNN, Republicans watch Fox News, Newsmax, OAN. But the problem here is that at some point you've got to get news from other sources. And this attack on January 6th was the biggest attack on by Americans on the U.S. government since the Civil War. The MAGA movement, and I know I'm going to say something very controversial here, the MAGA movement is the biggest threat to the American public since the Confederates. Yes, I said it, because this is, my good friend Abdul said, this was treason. This was insurrection, or as I said last time we talked about this, they behaved like terrorists. And I have a hard time believing if these protesters were African-American or Hispanic or Asian, would the response been the same. The point is that these people on this so-called MAGA movement behaved in a very terroristic manner, and they tried to overthrow our government. A duly elected president of the United States, who is our current president, Joe Biden, and Donald Trump lost. We're dealing with a man who couldn't deal with the fact that he lost. He was behaving like a petulant child, and he actually enjoyed watching this violence. And even said that, well, maybe they should hang Mike Pence. So I would say to all my Hoosier Republican friends, how can you support a man who called for the death of our former governor of Indiana? I think we Hoosier Democrats care more about Mike Pence than you Hoosier Republicans do. That's just outrageous. Any Hoosier Republican that still supports Mike Pence, that still supports Donald Trump, and when he called for basically the death of Mike Pence, should be ashamed of themselves, no doubt about it.
Well, I think the answer to that is, and I know Abdul is not a Republican per se, but from the Republican perspective, they still support Donald Trump because they think they can't win an election without supporting Donald Trump.
No, and that you're right, because just because of the nature of our election, how polarized our situation is these days, Donald Trump is still a major voice inside the Republican Party. Now that voice has been diminished over the last few years since he hasn't been in office, but Trump still has an impact on Republican primary voters. Just look at what happened over in Pennsylvania when Dr. Oz winning by less than 1,000 votes, but he still won. So Trump can check that off on the victory box. My thing is, with respect to these hearings, now, will these hearings really move the needle? No, if you liked Donald Trump before, you're going to like him even more. If you didn't like him, you're going to dislike him. These hearings are basically for those folks in the middle who kind of pay attention, but also kind of don't pay attention because they've got these things called lives going on. And so these hearings are for those folks in the middle who are either undecided or sort of non-committed and attempt to move the needle slightly more toward the Democrats and the Republicans in the midterm elections.
How much has that middle shrunk? I know we're looking at the entire country now, not just Indiana. How much has that political middle shrunk, do you think, Abdul? There just doesn't seem to be either. Actually, my friend, I'm going to directly disagree with you and push back just a little bit. Actually, I think the political middle has actually grown because people are just tired of the rhetoric and the histrionics and all sort of the blowhardedness that takes place in Washington, D.C. these days, that they're just sort of sick and tired of it. And so I think they're sort of sick and tired of Democrats and tired of Republicans. And so I think those folks, that's actually growing and growing every other day. So I think the political middle is getting bigger, but it's also, as it gets bigger, it also becomes more silent. I think that's a fair assessment. It's a big middle. It literally is a silent majority because people are just sort of sick and tired of all the Washington D.C. and all the political banter that goes back and forth.
Yeah, well, to Abdul's point, most Americans are in the middle. I'm center left, Abdul is center right. The extremes of our politics are why right now I believe our politics is so poisonous. But right now, the biggest threat to our country politically, and if I sound partisan as a partisan Democrat, so be it, is this MAGA movement. The biggest threat to our American Republic since the Confederates. I stand by that, no doubt about it.
Well, then how then do Democrats, if Abdul is right, how do you get that growing middle to at least be enough on your side to say hold control of Congress, Brian, if all you're going to hear back from some of them is, well, both parties are like this?
No, January 6th, I don't think the Democrats were there trying to overthrow the government. It was the Republicans. And even it wasn't even all Republicans. Like I just mentioned before, Vice President Mike Pence did the right thing. He followed the U.S. Constitution. And what was his reward for that? Hang Mike Pence. So my point to all Hoosier Republicans, if you stand by Donald Trump and you don't stand by Mike Pence, you should be ashamed of yourselves. So we just have to bring that message to not just Hoosier voters, but voters all over the country. We are the responsible party. We're the party that's going to follow the U.S. Constitution, and we're not the insurrectionist, treasonous party. That's the Republican Party. That's not even all Republicans. It's those Republicans who knuckle under and cower in fear of the MAGA movement.
Well, a lot more hearings to go and a lot more to talk about, I'm sure, once they are done. Abdul-Hakim, Shabazz, Brian Gaddie, our political insiders. We'll talk to you next week, gentlemen.
Always good to be here, my friend.
Thank you, Ray.